The home front during World War I covers the domestic, economic, social and political histories of countries involved in that conflict. It covers the mobilization of armed forces and war supplies, but does not include the military history. About 10 million combatants and 7 million civilians died during the entire war, including many weakened by years of malnutrition. They fell in the worldwide Spanish flu pandemic, which struck late in 1918, just as the war was ending. The Allies had much more potential wealth that they could spend on the war. One estimate is that the Allies spent $147 billion on the war and the Central Powers only $61 billion. Among the Allies, Britain and its empire spent $47 billion and the US $27 billion. Among the Central Powers, Germany spent $45 billion. Total war demanded total mobilization of all the nation's resources for a common goal. Manpower had to be channeled into the front lines. Behind the lines, labor power had to be redirected away from less necessary activities that were luxuries during a total war. In particular, vast munitions industries had to be built up to provide shells, guns, warships, uniforms, airplanes, and 100 other weapons, both old and new. Agriculture had to be mobilized as well, to provide food for both civilians and for soldiers and for horses to move supplies. Transportation in general was a challenge, especially when Britain and Germany each tried to intercept merchant ships headed for the enemy. Finance was a special challenge. Germany financed the Central Powers. Britain financed the Allies until 1916, when it ran out of money and had to borrow from the United States. The US took over the financing of the Allies in 1917 with loans that it insisted be repaid after the war. The victorious Allies looked to defeated Germany in 1919 to pay reparations that would cover some of their costs. Above all, it was essential to conduct the mobilization in such a way that the short-term confidence of the people was maintained, the long-term power of the political establishment was upheld, and the long-term economic health of the nation was preserved. For more details on economics, see Economic History of World War I. World War I had a profound impact on women's suffrage across the belligerents. Women played a major role on the home fronts, and many countries recognized their sacrifices with the vote during or shortly after the war, including the United States, Britain, Canada, Denmark, Austria, the Netherlands, Germany, Russia, Sweden and Ireland. Britain. See also Timeline of the United Kingdom home front during World War I. At the outbreak of war, patriotic feelings spread throughout the country, and many of the class barriers of Edwardian era faded during the years of combat. However, the Catholics in Southern Ireland moved overnight to demands for complete immediate independence after the failed Easter Rebellion of 1916. Northern Ireland remained loyal to the Crown. Economic sacrifices were made, however, in the name of defeating the enemy. In 1915, Liberal politician David Lloyd George took charge of the newly created Ministry of Munitions. He dramatically increased the output of artillery shells, the main weapon actually used in battle. In 1916 he became Secretary for War. Prime Minister H. Asquith was a disappointment. He formed a coalition government in 1915, but it was also ineffective. Asquith was replaced by Lloyd George in late 1916. He had a strong hand in the managing of every affair, making many decisions himself. Historians credit Lloyd George with providing the driving energy and organization that won the war. Although Germans were using Zeppelins to bomb the cities, morale remained relatively high due in part to the propaganda churned out by the national newspapers. With a severe shortage of skilled workers, industry redesigned work so that it could be done by unskilled men and women, so that war-related industries grew rapidly. Lloyd George cut a deal with the trades unions. They approved the dilution and threw their organizations into the war effort. Historian Arthur Marwick saw a radical transformation of British society. a deluge that swept away many old attitudes and brought in a more equalitarian society. He also saw the famous literary pessimism of the 1920s as misplaced, for there were major positive long-term consequences of the war. He pointed to new job opportunities and self-consciousness among workers that quickly built up the Labour Party, to the coming of partial woman suffrage, and to an acceleration of social reform and state control of the British economy. He found a decline of deference toward the aristocracy and established authority in general, and a weakening among youth of traditional restraints on individual moral behavior. Marwick concluded that class differentials softened, national cohesion increased, and British society became more equal. Scotland played a major role in the British effort in the First World War. It especially provided manpower, ships, machinery, food and money, engaging with the conflict with some enthusiasm. With a population of 4.8 million in 1911, Scotland sent 690,000 men to the war, of whom 74,000 died in combat or from disease, and 150,000 were seriously wounded. Scottish urban centres, with their poverty and unemployment, were favourite recruiting grounds of the regular British Army, and Dundee, where the female-dominated jute industry limited male employment, had one of the highest proportion of reservists and serving soldiers than almost any other British city. Concern for their families' standard of living made men hesitate to enlist. Voluntary enlistment rates went up after the government guaranteed a weekly stipend for life to the survivors of men who were killed or disabled. After the introduction of conscription from January 1916, every part of the country was affected. Occasionally Scottish troops made up large proportions of the active combatants, and suffered corresponding losers, as at the Battle of Lewes, where there were 3 full Scots divisions and other Scottish units. Thus, although Scots were only 10% of the British population, they made up 15% of the national armed forces and eventually accounted for 20% of the dead. Some areas, like the thinly populated island of Lewis and Harris, suffered some of the highest proportional losses of any part of Britain. Clydeside shipyards and the nearby engineering shops were the major centres of war industry in Scotland. In Glasgow, radical agitation led to industrial and political unrest that continued after the war ended. Politics. David Lloyd George became Prime Minister in December 1916 and immediately transformed the British war effort, taking firm control of both military and domestic policy. In rapid succession in spring 1918 came a series of military and political crises. The Germans, having moved troops from the Eastern Front and retrained them in new tactics, now had more soldiers on the Western Front than the Allies. Germany launched a full-scale spring offensive, starting March 21 against the British and French lines, with the hope of victory on the battlefield before the American troops arrived in numbers. The Allied armies fell back 40 miles in confusion, and facing defeat, London realized it needed more troops to fight a mobile war. Lloyd George found 500,000 soldiers and rushed them to France, asked American President Woodrow Wilson for immediate help, and agreed to the appointment of French General Foch as Commander-in-Chief on the Western Front so that Allied forces could be coordinated to handle the German offensive. Despite strong warnings it was a bad idea, the War Cabinet decided to impose conscription on Ireland. The main reason was that Labour in Britain demanded it as the price for cutting back on exemptions for certain workers. Labour wanted the principle established that no one was exempt, but it did not demand that the draft actually take place in Ireland. The proposal was enacted but never enforced. The Catholic bishops for the first time entered the fray, and called for open resistance to a draft. Many Irish Catholics and nationalists moved into the intransigent Sinn Féin movement. This proved a decisive moment, marking the end of Irish willingness to stay inside the UK, when on May 7, 1918, a senior army general on active duty, Major General Sir Frederick Morris went public with allegations that Lloyd George had lied to Parliament on military matters. A crisis was at hand. The German spring offensive had made unexpected major gains, and a scapegoat was needed. Asquith, the Liberal leader in the House, took up the allegations and attacked Lloyd George, which further split the Liberal Party. While Asquith's presentation was poorly done, Lloyd George vigorously defended his position, treating the debate as a vote of confidence. He won over the House with a powerful refutation of Morris's allegations. The main results were to strengthen Lloyd George, weaken Asquith, end public criticism of overall strategy, and strengthen civilian control of the military. Meanwhile, the German offensive stalled. By summer, the Americans were sending 10,000 fresh men a day to the Western Front, a more rapid response made possible by leaving their equipment behind and using British and French munitions. The German army had used up its last reserves and was steadily shrinking in number and weakening in resolve. Victory came on November 11, 1918. Women Prime Minister David Lloyd George was clear about how important the women were. It would have been utterly impossible for us to have waged a successful war had it not been for the skill and ardor, enthusiasm and industry which the women of this country have thrown into the war. The militant suffragette movement was suspended during the war, and at the time people credited the new patriotic roles women played as earning them the vote in 1918. However, British historians no longer emphasize the granting of women's suffrage as a reward for women's participation in war work. Pugh argues that enfranchising soldiers primarily and women secondarily was decided by senior politicians in 1916. In the absence of major women's groups demanding for equal suffrage, the government's conference recommended limited, age-restricted women's suffrage. The suffragettes had been weakened, Pugh argues, by repeated failures before 1914 and by the disorganizing effects of war mobilization. Therefore they quietly accepted these restrictions, which were approved in 1918 by a majority of the War Ministry and each political party in Parliament. More generally, Searle argues that the British debate was essentially over by the 1890s. And that granting the suffrage in 1918 was mostly a byproduct of giving the vote to male soldiers. Women in Britain finally achieved suffrage on the same terms as men in 1928.